The gunshot that echoed across Blackwood Plantation on a sweltering Texas night in September 1851 didn't come from the slave quarters where violence was as common as the cotton that grew in endless rows under the brutal sun. It came from the library of the main house, where Sarah Blackwood stood with a smoking pistol in her trembling hands, staring down at the bodies of her husband James, and the enslaved woman he had chosen over her, both of them dying on the Persian rug that Sarah's father had imported from the East as a wedding gift 7 years earlier, when she had still believed that marrying a wealthy plantation owner would bring her the life of dignity and respect she had been promised. The woman Eliza lay clutching her stomach where the first bullet had torn through her, while James crawled toward her with his own wound bleeding freely, trying even in his final moments to reach the woman he loved rather than look at the wife who had finally snapped after years of watching herself become invisible in her own home. The weapon in Sarah's hand had belonged to her father, a gift meant to protect her from dangers he never imagined would include her own husband's heart. Choosing someone who existed in law as property, but in reality as the only person James Blackwood had ever truly loved, and whose presence in his life had transformed Sarah from plantation mistress into a woman so consumed by rage and humiliation that murder had become the only language she could speak to make herself heard. If you want to understand how love destroyed 3 lives in 1851 Texas, where the rules about race and marriage and ownership created situations so twisted that violence became inevitable, where a wealthy white woman with every legal advantage found herself powerless against genuine affection between her husband and the woman they both technically owned, and where the peculiar institution of slavery revealed itself not just as systematic oppression, but as a poison that contaminated every human relationship it touched, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because the story of what happened at Blackwood Plantation will expose the rot at the heart of Southern society in ways that will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, power, and the terrible price of human bondage. The plantation that would become the site of Texas's most scandalous love triangle and triple death sat on 4,000 acres of rich bottomland along the Brazos River, where James Blackwood's father had established cotton operations in 1832 when Texas was still part of Mexico, and where the family had grown wealthy beyond measure by exploiting the labor of enslaved people who worked from sunrise to sunset, transforming raw land into an agricultural empire that produced over 600 bales of premium cotton every harvest season. James Blackwood had inherited this empire in 1848 at age 32 when his father died from fever, inheriting not just land and wealth but also 147 human beings who existed legally as his property, including a 19-year-old woman named Eliza whose mother had served as the previous master's house servant and whose education and refinement set her apart from other enslaved women at Blackwood Plantation in ways that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. The Texas of 1851 was different from the older slave states of Virginia or South Carolina, younger and wilder and less bound by the rigid social conventions that governed plantation society in the Deep South. But it operated according to the same fundamental rules about race and ownership that defined the entire slaveholding region. Rules that said white men could exploit enslaved women without consequence, that white wives were expected to ignore such exploitation as the price of their social position, and that enslaved people had no legal protection against any violence or sexual abuse their owners chose to inflict. James Blackwood in 1851 was 35 years old, tall and broad-shouldered from years of riding across his plantation supervising operations, educated at schools in New Orleans where he had learned the business of cotton and the management of enslaved labor, married for 7 years to Sarah Montgomery Blackwood, who came from another wealthy Texas planting family and who had brought her own enslaved people as dowry when they wed in 1844. The marriage had been arranged between their fathers as a business merger that united 2 fortunes and 2 tracts of adjoining land, creating one of the largest cotton operations in Texas, but it had never been a love match, and both James and Sarah had understood from the beginning that affection was not part of their contract, only the production of heirs and the maintenance of social position. The early years had been marked by the kind of distant politeness that characterized many planter marriages, with James managing agricultural operations while Sarah oversaw the household and gave birth to 2 sons, who would carry the Blackwood name into the next generation. But everything had changed in 1849 when James's father died and the will was read, revealing that the old man had left specific instructions about certain enslaved people, including Eliza, who was to remain at Blackwood Plantation and never be sold away, and who was described in the will's language as having been particularly valuable to the family in ways that everyone understood, but no one would openly acknowledge that Eliza in 1851 was 22 years old, of mixed race with features that revealed white ancestry no one would claim, educated beyond what was legal or common for enslaved people in Texas, and possessed of an intelligence and dignity that made her situation as property all the more obscene and impossible to reconcile with any claims that slavery was a benevolent institution caring for inferior beings. Her mother had taught her to read and write using books stolen from the main house, had trained her in music and literature, and the kind of refined accomplishments that wealthy white women cultivated, and had given her daughter tools to navigate a world that wanted to reduce her to labor and breeding stock, but couldn't quite manage to crush the person she had become despite her legal status. The relationship between James and Eliza had begun in 1849, shortly after his father's death, initially following the familiar pattern of master exercising sexual access to enslaved woman, but transforming over months into something that neither of them had anticipated or knew how to name within a society that had no language for genuine affection between people separated by the chasm of slavery. What started as exploitation had become conversations that revealed their unexpected compatibility, shared interests in books and ideas that James's wife dismissed as impractical, and ultimately an emotional connection that felt more real to James than anything in his arranged marriage to Sarah. The transformation from sexual exploitation to something James convinced himself was love had occurred gradually during 1849 and early 1850, as he found himself seeking Eliza's company not just for physical satisfaction but for the kind of intellectual and emotional companionship that his marriage had never provided and never could. Given the complete incompatibility between himself and Sarah, Eliza possessed a mind that challenged his assumptions, a perspective shaped by experiencing slavery from inside its machinery, and a capacity for insight about human nature that James found compelling in ways he struggled to articulate even to himself. The specific moment when he realized he loved her, rather than simply desired her, came during a conversation about a novel they had both read. When Eliza offered an interpretation that revealed depths of thought James had never encountered in the white women of his social circle, who were educated to be ornamental rather than intellectual, and who would have been scandalized by the kinds of discussions he and Eliza shared in the privacy of her cabin. The realization that this woman he legally owned was actually his intellectual equal or superior had been profoundly destabilizing, forcing James to confront contradictions between his treatment of Eliza as property and his growing recognition of her as fully human and worthy of respect that slavery claimed no black person deserved, but recognizing Eliza as human and loving her genuinely didn't lead James to question slavery as an institution or to free her and attempt to build a life together outside Texas's slave society. Instead, he had tried to create a relationship with her within the confines of the system, building her a separate cabin away from the slave quarters where she lived in relative comfort, spending his nights with her rather than with his wife, and making no effort to conceal his preference for Eliza's company over Sarah's, apparently believing that honesty was superior to the hypocrisy that characterized most white men's exploitation of enslaved women. The house he built for Eliza in 1850 was modest but well constructed, with real windows and a wooden floor and furnishings that elevated it far above the rough cabins where other enslaved people lived, a structure that announced to everyone at Blackwood Plantation and to neighboring families that James's relationship with Eliza had transcended casual sexual exploitation to become something more permanent and acknowledged. The scandal this created among Texas's planting families was immediate and intense, violating social conventions that said such relationships should be conducted secretly and never acknowledged openly, and creating a situation where Sarah found herself humiliated not just privately but publicly as her husband's obvious preference for his enslaved concubine became the subject of gossip throughout their region. Sarah Blackwood's journey from plantation mistress to murderer spanned the 2 years between 1849, when James's relationship with Eliza became obvious, and September 1851, when she finally cracked under the accumulated weight of humiliation, rage, and the unbearable knowledge that she meant nothing to her husband while an enslaved woman she technically owned had captured his heart completely. The particular cruelty of Sarah's situation involved possessing every legal and social advantage that Texas society could provide, yet finding all that privilege meaningless when confronted with the simple fact that James loved Eliza and would never love his legal wife regardless of what Sarah did or said or threatened. The daily evidence of her husband's preference corroded Sarah's sense of self-worth systematically, as she watched James spend his evenings at Eliza's cabin rather than with his family, saw him treat Eliza with tenderness and respect he had never shown his wife, and understood that she had become irrelevant in her own household, except as the mother of his legitimate sons and the manager of domestic operations that James barely noticed. The social consequences for Sarah of James's open relationship with Eliza had been devastating in ways that transcended personal hurt, as neighboring plantation families distanced themselves from a woman whose husband had so publicly humiliated her by preferring his enslaved concubine to his legal wife. The conventions that normally protected white women's dignity, the understanding that husbands' sexual exploitation of enslaved women would be conducted discreetly enough that wives could pretend ignorance, had been violated so thoroughly by James's obvious emotional investment in Eliza that other plantation mistresses didn't know how to interact with Sarah anymore. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent, visits from other women stopped almost entirely, and Sarah found herself increasingly isolated in a household where even the enslaved people seemed to understand that Eliza held more real influence than the legal mistress, despite all the racial and legal hierarchies that should have made such a situation impossible. The specific incidents that marked Sarah's psychological deterioration over those 2 years included discovering that James had given Eliza access to the main house library, learning that he discussed plantation business decisions with Eliza rather than with his wife, and most devastatingly overhearing James tell Eliza that she made him happier than anyone else in his life, words he had never spoken to Sarah during their 7 years of marriage. The children's awareness of their father's relationship with Eliza created additional trauma for Sarah, as she watched her 2 sons, aged 6 and 4 in 1851, develop confusion about family structure and racial hierarchy that their father's behavior had made impossible to resolve with the simple certainties that normally shaped white children's understanding of slavery. James had not tried to hide his relationship from his sons, apparently believing that children should understand the truth about their father's affections, rather than being raised on the lies that characterized most plantation families' handling of such situations. The result was that the Blackwood boys grew up knowing their father loved Eliza in ways he didn't love their mother, creating questions about marriage and race and family that Sarah couldn't answer without acknowledging her own humiliation and her husband's preference for someone she was supposed to control but couldn't. The legal impossibility of Sarah divorcing James or of James marrying Eliza, even if divorce had been possible, meant that all 3 of them were trapped in a situation that Texas law and social custom had no mechanisms to resolve, creating psychological pressure that was building toward catastrophe with the inevitability of a storm gathering on the horizon. Sarah couldn't leave her marriage without losing her children, her social position, and probably her inheritance, since divorce was nearly impossible in Texas, and would have marked her as fallen, regardless of her husband's behavior. James couldn't legally marry Eliza even if he somehow managed to divorce Sarah, because Texas law prohibited marriage between white men and women of African descent regardless of their free or enslaved status. And Eliza herself had no legal agency whatsoever, existing in law as property that could be sold or given away or killed at the whim of owners who would never face consequences for any abuse they chose to inflict, regardless of whatever emotions were involved in their relationship. Sarah's various attempts to resolve the situation over those 2 years had all failed spectacularly, demonstrating both her desperation and her complete lack of effective options within a system that gave white wives significant power over enslaved people but no ability to command their husbands' affections or to escape marriages that had become unbearable. Her first attempt had been seduction, trying to win back James's attention through appearance and behavior. But this had failed because James's preference for Eliza wasn't based on physical attraction alone, but on genuine intellectual and emotional connection that Sarah couldn't replicate even if she had been willing to try, and which their fundamental incompatibility of temperament and interests made impossible anyway. Her second attempt had been to sell Eliza away, exercising her legal right as co-owner of Blackwood's enslaved population to remove the woman who had replaced her in her husband's affections, and she had arranged a sale to a plantation in Louisiana. without consulting James, believing that physical separation would end their relationship and force James to accept reality. But James had discovered the plan before the sale could be completed, had confronted Sarah with fury she had never seen from him before, and had then transferred legal ownership of Eliza entirely to himself to prevent Sarah from ever attempting such action again, demonstrating that he would protect Eliza from his wife's revenge, regardless of what it cost their marriage. The failure of that plan and James's obvious determination to keep Eliza regardless of Sarah's feelings had taught Sarah that she had no leverage over the situation, that her husband valued his enslaved lover more than his legal wife's dignity or their marriage's survival. Her third attempt had been public confrontation, inviting neighboring plantation families for dinner and then making pointed remarks about James's relationship with Eliza in front of guests, apparently hoping that social pressure from his peers would shame him into ending, or at least concealing his preference for his enslaved concubine. But this had backfired catastrophically, as guests had been scandalized not by James's behavior, but by Sarah's violation of the convention that such matters were never discussed openly, and James himself had responded by becoming even more openly affectionate with Eliza, spending entire days with her and making no effort to hide their relationship, as if daring his wife and his neighbors to criticize an arrangement he claimed was nobody's business but his own. The pregnancy that Eliza announced in June 1851 represented the final unbearable development in a situation that had already pushed Sarah to the edge of psychological collapse, creating a biological connection between James and Eliza that would be permanent and visible, producing a child who would legally belong to Sarah since enslaved children followed their mother's status, forcing Sarah to own her husband's illegitimate child by another woman, and to watch that child grow up at Blackwood. Plantation as a constant reminder of her humiliation and her husband's preference for someone she was supposed to control but never could. The psychological horror of that situation, being forced by law to own her husband's child by his enslaved lover, was more than Sarah's already fragile mental state could bear, and in the weeks after learning about Eliza's pregnancy, she began planning the murders with a methodical precision that suggested both deteriorating sanity and desperate determination to ensure that if she couldn't have James's love, no one would survive to enjoy relationships that made a mockery of her marriage and her position as plantation mistress. The relationship between James and Eliza that would ultimately cost both their lives had evolved over 2 years from exploitation to something that James genuinely believed was love, though whether such a relationship between master and enslaved woman could ever truly be called love remained a question that would trouble historians studying the case for generations to come. The beginning had followed the familiar pattern of white men exercising sexual access to enslaved women they owned, with James initially viewing Eliza as simply another form of property available for his use. But over months of interaction, something had shifted in ways that neither of them fully understood or could easily explain, within a society that had no language for genuine affection between people separated by slavery's legal and racial categories. The conversations that revealed Eliza's formidable intelligence had surprised James, who had been raised to believe that enslaved people were intellectually inferior and incapable of the kind of abstract thought and cultural sophistication that white people possessed, but who found himself confronted with a woman whose insights about literature and music and human nature challenged every assumption he had been taught about racial hierarchy and mental capacity. The specific moment when James realized he loved Eliza rather than simply desired her occurred during a discussion about Shakespeare's plays, which Eliza had read despite Texas laws that made teaching enslaved people to read a criminal offense, and which she interpreted with a depth and nuance that James had never encountered, even among educated white men of his acquaintance. Her analysis of power dynamics in King Lear had forced James to confront uncomfortable parallels between the play's exploration of authority and madness and the plantation system he participated in, where legal power to own other humans coexisted uneasily with the reality that enslaved people possessed inner lives and intellectual capacities that slavery claimed didn't exist. The recognition that Eliza was his intellectual equal or superior had been profoundly destabilizing for James, creating cognitive dissonance between his treatment of her as property and his growing awareness of her as a fully human person deserving respect and autonomy that the slave system could never provide. But that recognition hadn't led James to free Eliza or to question slavery as an institution. revealing the profound moral incoherence that characterized even the most enlightened slaveholders who acknowledged enslaved people's humanity while refusing to abandon the economic and social benefits that came from treating humans as property. Instead, James had convinced himself that loving Eliza genuinely and treating her with respect somehow compensated for the fundamental wrong of owning her, that providing comfortable quarters and emotional intimacy and intellectual companionship made their relationship acceptable despite the grotesque power imbalance that meant she could never refuse him without risking sale or punishment or death. The house he built for Eliza represented his attempt to create a space where they could interact as something approaching equals, where the brutal realities of slavery could be temporarily suspended in favor of domestic intimacy that resembled a real marriage, even though Texas law and social custom made any such relationship legally impossible and morally compromised by the fact that she remained his property regardless of his feelings. Eliza's own perspective on her relationship with James, as much as it can be reconstructed from letters she wrote to her mother who had been sold to a plantation in Arkansas, and from testimonies of other enslaved people at Blackwood who knew her, revealed a woman navigating impossible circumstances with intelligence and pragmatism, born of understanding that her survival depended on managing a situation she had no power to escape. She recognized that James's affection for her was genuine within the limits of what was possible for a man who owned her. But she also understood that love between master and slave could never be freely given or received, that the privileges she enjoyed as his favored concubine were always contingent on his continued affection and could be revoked at any moment, and that her children with James would be enslaved regardless of their white paternity, because Texas law defined enslaved status through the mother's condition rather than the father's identity. The letters that Eliza wrote to her mother, preserved in a collection at the University of Texas archives, revealed a woman who appreciated the relative safety and comfort that James's love provided, while maintaining no illusions about the precariousness of her position or the fundamental impossibility of real partnership between people separated by slavery's legal categories. He tells me he loves me, and I believe his feelings are sincere as far as a master can love someone he owns, Eliza had written in one letter from March 1851. But I am not foolish enough to forget that I remain his property regardless of his emotions, that everything I have could disappear if he dies, or if his feelings change, and that our child will be born into the same slavery I live in no matter how much he claims to love me. I am grateful for the life he has given me, compared to what most enslaved women endure, the violence and exploitation they suffer without even the pretense of affection or respect. But I understand that this is still a cage, even if it is more comfortable than most, and that I remain enslaved regardless of how he feels about me. The letter revealed Eliza's clear-eyed understanding of power dynamics that James apparently couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Her recognition that genuine love required freedom to choose or refuse that she would never possess as long as she remained his property, and her awareness that the child growing inside her would inherit her enslaved status rather than his free one, producing another generation trapped by laws that made slavery hereditary through maternal lines. The development of Sarah's psychological state during those 2 years between James's relationship becoming obvious and the night of the murders represented a journey through various stages of response to unbearable circumstances, from initial denial that anything significant was happening, through wounded pride at being supplanted by an enslaved woman, to rage at the humiliation of having her husband's preference known throughout their region, to depression as she recognized that nothing she could do would restore affection that had never existed in their marriage, and finally to a kind of cold determination that if she couldn't have James's love or even his respect, she would ensure that no one survived to enjoy relationships that made a mockery of everything she believed about her rightful place in the world. The specific incidents that marked Sarah's descent into homicidal rage included both major crises and daily indignities that accumulated into psychological pressure that eventually found release only through violence. The discovery in early 1850 that James was spending most nights at Eliza's cabin rather than in the marital bed had been the first major crisis, leading to a confrontation where Sarah had demanded that James end the relationship immediately and sell Eliza away to restore their marriage and her dignity. His refusal had been delivered with a bluntness that shattered any remaining illusions Sarah had maintained about their relationship, as James had stated explicitly that he would not separate from Eliza, regardless of what his wife demanded, that he felt more genuine connection with Eliza than he had ever felt with Sarah, and that their arranged marriage had been a business transaction rather than a union based on affection, which meant Sarah had no right to expect emotional fidelity. She had never wanted before discovering she had been replaced. The power dynamics of that refusal had been particularly devastating for Sarah, who had expected that her status as white wife would automatically trump any feelings James had for an enslaved woman, but who discovered that legal and racial hierarchies didn't determine emotional priorities in the ways she had always assumed they must. The construction of Eliza's separate cabin in 1850 had represented another major escalation, as James had effectively built a second household for his enslaved lover while Sarah remained in the main house raising their sons largely alone, creating a physical symbol of their separated lives that everyone at Blackwood Plantation and throughout their region could see and understand. The cabin's quality, far superior to the rough structures where other enslaved people lived, announced James's intentions more clearly than words ever could, demonstrating that he viewed Eliza as deserving comforts and considerations that he would never extend to common field hands, and creating scandal among neighboring families who couldn't help noticing the structure and recognizing what it represented. The social consequences for Sarah had been immediate and brutal, as other plantation mistresses began distancing themselves from a woman whose husband had so publicly chosen his enslaved concubine over his legal wife, violating the social contract that said such relationships should be conducted quietly, enough that wives could maintain their dignity through strategic ignorance. The daily indignities that accelerated Sarah's psychological deterioration included watching James spend his evenings at Eliza's cabin discussing books and ideas while Sarah sat alone in the main house, observing him treat Eliza with a gentleness and consideration he had never shown his wife during 7 years of marriage, hearing him laugh with Eliza in ways he never laughed with Sarah, and understanding that she had become functionally invisible in her own household except as manager of domestic operations and mother to sons who were starting to question why their father preferred Eliza's company to their mother's. The enslaved people at Blackwood, who understood power dynamics better than most white people because their survival depended on reading subtle signals, had recognized that Eliza held more real influence than Sarah despite the racial and legal hierarchies that should have made such a situation impossible, and some of them had begun treating Sarah with the kind of barely concealed disrespect that suggested they understood she had been demoted in everything but official title. The social isolation that Sarah experienced during 1850 and 1851 as neighboring plantation families distanced themselves from the scandal at Blackwood had been psychologically devastating in ways that transcended personal hurt, as the networks of female friendship and social engagement that normally sustained plantation mistresses' sense of identity and self-worth were systematically withdrawn. The invitations to gatherings became less frequent and then stopped entirely. The visits from other women dried up as Sarah became someone whose situation was too awkward to address, and she found herself increasingly alone with her humiliation and rage in a household where even her own enslaved servants seemed to understand that she had lost the power struggle with Eliza despite possessing every legal and social advantage. The particular cruelty of Sarah's situation involved being surrounded by people who could see her degradation, but who either couldn't help her or actively participated in it, creating a psychological pressure cooker that had no safety valve and nowhere to release except through violence. The children's relationships with both their mother and Eliza had created additional trauma for Sarah as she watched her sons develop genuine affection for the woman who had replaced their mother in their father's affections. Confusion about family structure and racial hierarchy that James's openness about his relationship had made impossible to resolve with simple explanations. James had encouraged his sons to spend time with Eliza, to view her as someone worthy of respect despite her enslaved status, apparently believing that children should learn to see enslaved people as fully human, rather than as the inferior beings that Southern society claimed them to be. The result had been that the Blackwood boys grew up with profoundly mixed messages about race, slavery and family, loving their mother but understanding that their father didn't, enjoying Eliza's company but understanding that she was legally property their family owned, grappling with contradictions, that their young minds couldn't fully process, but that shaped their understanding of relationships in ways that would affect them long after the murders destroyed their family completely. Sarah's final attempt to resolve the situation before resorting to murder came in May 1851, when she approached James with a proposal that revealed both her desperation and her willingness to accept almost any arrangement that would restore some dignity to her position. She offered to leave Blackwood with their sons and retire to property her father owned in East Texas, essentially abandoning their marriage and allowing James to live openly with Eliza, without Sarah's presence as constant reminder of his violation of social conventions, asking only that James provide adequate financial support and not contest custody of their children. The proposal represented Sarah's recognition that she had lost the battle for her husband's affection and her attempt to salvage at least her children and her financial security from the wreckage of their marriage, accepting humiliation as the price of escaping a situation that had become psychologically unbearable. But James had refused even this compromise, stating that their sons needed to remain at Blackwood to learn the cotton business and inherit the plantation that would someday be theirs, that Sarah's departure would create scandal worse than the current situation, and that he expected her to continue functioning as plantation mistress and mother to his legitimate heirs regardless of his relationship with Eliza, apparently believing that Sarah should accept a loveless marriage and public humiliation as the price of maintaining their family's social position and economic interests. The refusal of even this escape route had marked the point where Sarah's psychological state shifted from depression and rage into something colder and more dangerous, a kind of desperate clarity that if she couldn't leave the situation and couldn't change it and couldn't bear it, then the only remaining option was to end it permanently through violence that would destroy everyone involved, including herself. The planning that followed revealed both methodical preparation and deteriorating mental stability, as Sarah began acquiring the weapon she would use, arranging for her sons to be away from Blackwood on the night she had chosen for the murders, and writing letters that would serve as confession and explanation for what she was about to do. The pistol she chose had belonged to her father, a symbol of the protection and authority that she had expected to carry into her marriage, but which had proven useless against the simple fact that James loved someone else and no amount of legal power could force him to love his wife instead. The pregnancy announcement that came in June 1851 represented the final straw that transformed Sarah from bitter wife, contemplating violence, into active murderer making concrete plans for when and how to kill her husband and his enslaved lover. The prospect of Eliza bearing James's child created a situation so perverse and humiliating that Sarah could find no way to accept it, no mental framework that would allow her to remain at Blackwood watching her husband's illegitimate child grow up as constant reminder of her failure to command his affections. The child would be legally Sarah's property since enslaved children followed their mother's status regardless of paternity, meaning she would be forced to own her husband's child by another woman, to watch that child every day as proof of James's preference for Eliza, and either to raise her stepchild as enslaved property or to sell her husband's offspring to remove the evidence of his infidelity, knowing that either choice would destroy whatever remained of their marriage and her sense of herself as a moral person. The psychological horror of that impossible situation pushed Sarah past whatever restraints had kept her from acting on violent impulses, and in the weeks after learning about Eliza's pregnancy, she moved from contemplating murder to actively planning when and how to kill them both. The evening of September 18, 1851, had been chosen carefully by Sarah for several factors that would make murder possible. With her sons away visiting her parents in East Texas, as she had arranged weeks earlier to ensure they wouldn't witness what she was about to do, with James following his regular pattern of spending the evening at Eliza's cabin, and with the heat and humidity of late summer Texas, creating conditions where people stayed inside after dark rather than walking around the plantation where they might interrupt what Sarah was planning. The walk from the main house to Eliza's cabin took Sarah approximately 5 minutes through oppressive heat that pressed down like a physical weight. But during those minutes she transformed from plantation mistress into murderer, her mind cycling through 2 years of accumulated humiliation and rage while her hand gripped the loaded pistol concealed in the folds of her dress. The weapon felt heavy and cold despite the heat, a tangible symbol of the violence that had been building inside her for months, and with each step toward the cabin where her husband and his Enslaved lover played at being married despite the legal impossibilities that should have prevented such relationships from ever feeling real or permanent. The scene that greeted Sarah when she reached Eliza's cabin represented everything that had driven her to this moment of ultimate violence. As James and Eliza sat together at a small table near the window, books open before them, discussing literature as if they were any ordinary married couple enjoying each other's company, rather than master and enslaved woman engaged in a relationship that violated every social convention Sarah had been raised to believe was sacred and inviolable. James's hand rested on Eliza's shoulder in a gesture of casual intimacy that spoke to years of genuine partnership, while Eliza's face showed the kind of contentment and happiness that Sarah had never inspired in her husband during 7 years of marriage. And the domestic tranquility of the scene was more unbearable than any explicit display of physical affection could have been, because it proved that James had built with Eliza the kind of life that should have existed in his legal marriage but which had been impossible with Sarah because they had never loved each other and never could. Sarah stood in the doorway for several seconds watching them before either noticed her presence, the pistol now visible in her hand but not yet raised or aimed, wanting them to see her face and understand why they were about to die before the violence began, needing them to recognize that this wasn't sudden madness, but the inevitable conclusion of 2 years of systematic humiliation and psychological torture that they had inflicted through their relationship. James looked up first, his expression shifting from surprise to concern and then to something approaching fear as he registered the weapon in his wife's hand and understood that the situation had escalated beyond the verbal confrontations and emotional scenes that had characterized their marriage's collapse over the past 2 years. "Sarah, what are you doing?" he said quietly, rising from his chair but making no move toward her, apparently recognizing that approaching a woman holding a loaded pistol would be unwise regardless of their marital relationship. "Put the gun down and let's discuss this like reasonable people. Whatever you're thinking right now, violence isn't the answer to our situation." The response that Sarah delivered in that moment encompassed 2 years of accumulated pain transformed into homicidal clarity. Her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands and the tears that had begun streaming down her face. "Reasonable people?" she said, her tone carrying a flatness that indicated emotion too profound for normal expression. "You want to discuss being reasonable while you sit here with your slave pretending to be husband and wife? You want to talk about solutions when you refused every compromise I offered? When you chose her over your own family? When you're about to have a child with her while I raise your legitimate sons alone? There are no reasonable solutions left, James. You made certain of that when you decided your feelings for her mattered more than your vows to me, more than our children's well-being, more than my dignity or my sanity. So yes, violence is the only language left that will make you understand what you've done to me, what you've done to our family, what this situation has cost me every single day for 2 years while you played house with someone you own." The first shot came before James could respond, the pistol's report deafening in the small cabin's confined space, the bullet catching James in the chest as he lunged toward Sarah in what might have been an attempt to disarm her, or might have been instinctive movement to protect Eliza from the violence he saw coming. James fell backward against the table, scattering the books they had been reading, his hand clutching the wound that was already bleeding freely through his shirt, his eyes wide with shock and pain and something that looked like incomprehension, as if he genuinely couldn't understand how his wife's rage had escalated from emotional scenes to actual murder. The blood that spread across his chest formed a stark contrast against his white shirt, proof that Sarah had finally found a way to make herself heard after years of being ignored and dismissed and made invisible in her own marriage. Eliza had screamed and tried to flee toward the cabin's back door, but Sarah was faster, moving with the kind of desperate speed that comes from fury rather than physical conditioning, intercepting Eliza before she could reach safety. The second shot caught Eliza in her side as she turned to face Sarah, the bullet tearing through her pregnant belly in ways that ensured not just her death but the death of the unborn child that represented the final, unbearable proof of James's preference for his enslaved lover over his legal wife. Eliza collapsed to the floor, clutching her stomach, her face showing not just pain but a kind of terrible understanding that she had always known this situation would end in violence, that the relative safety and comfort James's love provided had always been temporary and contingent, and that enslaved women who became too important to white men inevitably, paid for that importance with their lives, whether through jealous wives or angry relatives or the inexorable machinery of slavery itself. "Please," Eliza gasped through blood that was filling her mouth, her hands desperately trying to protect her unborn child, even though the wound had already made survival impossible for both of them. "Please think about the baby. Your husband's child. Please don't do this. Please." But Sarah's rage extended to the unborn child that would have forced her to either own her stepchild as enslaved property or sell her husband's offspring to remove evidence of his infidelity. And she fired again, the third shot striking Eliza in the chest and ending both her life and her pleas for mercy that Sarah was beyond granting or even hearing through the roaring in her ears that drowned out everything except the satisfaction of finally making them understand what they had cost her through their relationship. James had managed to crawl across the floor toward Eliza despite his own mortal wound, reaching her body and pulling her against him in a final gesture that proved even dying. He loved her more than he had ever loved his wife, his blood mixing with hers on the cabin's rough wooden floor while Sarah stood over them both with the smoking pistol still in her hand. "You chose her," Sarah said, her voice breaking as the reality of what she had done began penetrating the rage that had carried her through the violence. "You chose her over everything, over me, over our sons, over your own life apparently. And now look what you've forced me to do. Look what you've made me become. I'm a murderer because you couldn't love me, because she existed, because this system let you own someone and love them and destroy our family without anyone stopping you or helping me or giving me any way out except this." James's response came as gurgled words, through blood filling his lungs. Something that might have been "loved her" or "sorry" or simply incoherent sounds as his body shut down from trauma and blood loss. But his eyes held an expression that Sarah would remember during her final hour. Not anger or fear, but something approaching pity, as if even dying he recognized that she had destroyed herself along with the people she had killed. That violence hadn't restored her dignity or made her visible or solved anything except ensuring that all three of them would die, rather than continuing to live in an impossible situation. His death came within minutes, his arms still wrapped around Eliza's body in a final embrace that excluded Sarah even in death, proving that nothing she could do would ever make James love her the way he had loved the woman they both had owned but neither had truly controlled. The discovery of the murders came from an enslaved man named Samuel who served as Blackwood's blacksmith and who had been working late in his forge when he heard the gunshots coming from Eliza's cabin. 3 distinct reports that echoed across the plantation in the stillness of the Texas night. Samuel's decision about whether to investigate or to remain in his forge and claim ignorance of what had clearly been violence involving white people represented the kind of impossible choice that enslaved people faced constantly. Knowing that witnessing white violence could make them targets while ignoring it might result in punishment for failing to intervene or report. Understanding that their testimony as enslaved people had no legal weight, but that their presence as witnesses made them dangerous to white people who wanted crimes concealed. Samuel had ultimately decided to approach the cabin cautiously, staying in shadows and moving quietly. Arriving in time to see Sarah standing over the bodies of her husband and his enslaved lover, the pistol still in her hand and her face showing an expression that combined satisfaction and horror in equal measure. The other enslaved people who had heard the shots and gathered at a safe distance to observe what was happening understood immediately what they were witnessing, recognizing the culmination of tensions that had been building at Blackwood Plantation for 2 years as James's relationship with Eliza became more open and Sarah's humiliation became more obvious, and the inevitable collision between white wife's rage and master's preference approached its violent conclusion. The witnesses later testified that they had remained hidden rather than trying to intervene, understanding that enslaved people who interfered in white violence typically found themselves punished regardless of their intentions, and that Sarah in her current psychological state represented a danger to anyone who approached her, whether white or black, enslaved or free. They watched from concealment as Sarah stood over the bodies for several minutes, watched her kneel beside her dead husband and speak to his corpse in words they couldn't hear, watched her finally turn and walk slowly back toward the main house with the pistol still in her hand, her movement suggesting someone in shock rather than someone who had just committed deliberate double murder. The wing walked back to the main house that Sarah made, after the murders was witnessed by multiple enslaved people who had been drawn by the gunshots and who watched from various hiding places as their mistress returned covered in blood spatter, the weapon still in her hand, her face a mask of terrible calm that suggested she had moved beyond normal emotional registers into something that transcended both rage and grief. The enslaved witnesses understood that they were watching the complete psychological collapse of a woman whose every legal and social advantage had proven insufficient to protect her from the emotional devastation of being unloved in a marriage that gave her every right except the ability to command her husband's affection. And some of them felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction at seeing white power destroy itself and horror at the violence that slavery's sexual exploitation and psychological pressures inevitably produced. Sarah's actions during the final hour of her life suggested both continued clarity about practical matters and complete resignation to her own death as the inevitable consequence of what she had done, revealing that she had planned not just the murders, but her own suicide as the final act in the tragedy that James's love for Eliza had set in motion. She went first to her son's empty bedroom, seeming to need to confirm that they were indeed away visiting her parents as she had arranged, protecting them from witnessing the violence, even though they would still have to live with the knowledge of what their mother had done and why she had felt murder was her only remaining option. She then retired to her own bedroom where she washed the blood from her hands and face, changed into a clean dress that her father had given her as a wedding present 7 years earlier, when she had still believed that marriage would bring happiness and security, and sat at her writing desk to compose letters that would serve as confession, explanation, and final testimony about what had driven her to murder. The letters that Sarah wrote during her final hour revealed a woman who understood that her actions were monstrous, but who felt that she had been pushed beyond endurance by a situation that Texas society had no mechanisms to resolve, that gave white wives legal power over enslaved people, but no ability to command their husbands' love, or to escape marriages that had become unbearable. The first letter, addressed to her sons, explained why their mother had needed to end a situation that was destroying her sanity and their family's stability, begging them to understand that she had acted from unbearable pain rather than evil intent, and asking them to remember that she had loved them even if her final act suggested otherwise. "My dearest boys," she had written, her handwriting showing the trembling that indicated either physical exhaustion or emotional collapse. "By the time you read this, your mother will be gone, and your father too, and you will be orphans because of what I have done tonight. I know you will struggle to understand why I killed your father and Eliza, why I chose violence over continuing to live in a marriage where I meant nothing while she meant everything to him. I hope someday you will understand that I had no other choice, that I tried every possible solution and your father refused them all, that watching him love her while treating me like furniture in my own house destroyed something inside me that could only be restored through ending the situation permanently." The second letter, addressed to Sarah's parents, apologized for the scandal and begged them to raise her orphan sons with love and honesty about what had happened, to help the boys understand the impossible pressures that slavery created for everyone it touched, including white women who found themselves competing with enslaved women for their husbands' affections in a system that made such competition both inevitable and unacknowledgeable. "I know this will bring shame on our family," Sarah had written, "but I could not continue living as the wife James didn't love while watching him build a life with someone he owned, could not raise his child by another woman as my property, could not accept that my legal advantages meant nothing when confronted with his genuine feelings for her. I am sorry for the pain this will cause you, for the orphaned grandchildren you will have to raise, for the questions you will face about what drove me to this, but I am not sorry for ending a situation that had already killed everything good in me and was destroying our son's understanding of family and marriage and what it means to be human." The third letter, addressed to Texas authorities, provided full confession to both murders and clearly stated that no one at Blackwood except herself bore responsibility for what had occurred, protecting the enslaved people who had witnessed the violence from any accusation of complicity or failure to intervene. "I, Sarah Montgomery Blackwood, do hereby confess to the deliberate murder of my husband James Blackwood and his enslaved woman Eliza on the evening of September 18th, 1851. She had written in language that suggested she understood the legal implications of what she was documenting. No one at Blackwood Plantation except myself had any knowledge of my intentions or any ability to prevent what occurred. The enslaved people here are guilty of nothing except living under a system that creates situations like mine, where white men's sexual exploitation of women they own destroys marriages and drives wives to desperate violence that accomplishes nothing except adding more death to a system already built on human suffering. The method Sarah chose for her own death revealed both practical consideration and symbolic significance as she loaded the final bullet into the pistol that had killed her husband and his lover, placed the barrel against her own temple, and pulled the trigger in a final act that completed the night's death toll at 3 people whose relationships had violated every convention of Texas plantation society. The sound of the shot brought enslaved house servants running to investigate, but by the time they reached Sarah's bedroom, she was already dead. Her body collapsed across the writing desk where she had arranged her letters for easy discovery, the pistol fallen from her hand to the floor, her blood soaking into papers that explained in her own words why she had felt that murder and suicide were her only remaining options in a situation that had destroyed her marriage, her sanity, and ultimately her life. The discovery of Sarah's body approximately 1 hour after the murders came when an enslaved house servant named Martha went to check on the mistress after hearing the final gunshot and becoming concerned when Sarah didn't respond to knocking on her bedroom door. Martha had found her mistress dead at the writing desk with the pistol on the floor and letters carefully arranged where they would be found immediately. The suicide completing the night's tragedy in ways that left Blackwood Plantation without clear authority or leadership and created a power vacuum that would have profound consequences for the enslaved, people whose lives depended on stable management and clear chains of command. The scene in Sarah's bedroom revealed someone who had maintained enough composure even after committing double murder to arrange practical matters and document her reasons, suggesting that she had been functioning with terrible clarity about consequences and purposes rather than acting in a rage-induced blackout. The immediate aftermath as enslaved people at Blackwood grappled with the triple death created chaos and uncertainty about what would happen next, who would take control of the plantation, whether they might be blamed for failing to prevent the violence, and whether new owners would sell them away to settle the estate or punish them for the scandals that had occurred under their watch. Samuel and Martha and other enslaved people who had witnessed various aspects of the night's violence gathered in the slave quarters to discuss what they had seen and what it meant, understanding that white violence had destroyed the Blackwood family, but that enslaved people would likely suffer consequences regardless of their complete lack of agency in situations created entirely by white people's choices about love and ownership and murder. Some considered fleeing in the chaos before James's relatives arrived to claim the property, while others argued that running would make them look guilty of crimes they hadn't committed and would result in slave catchers hunting them down with dogs and guns regardless of their innocence. The scene at Eliza's cabin when enslaved people finally approached it after Sarah's suicide revealed the full horror of what had transpired, with James's body sprawled on the floor where he had crawled to reach Eliza, with Eliza herself lying in a pool of blood that had spread across the rough wooden floor, her hands still clutching her pregnant belly in a futile attempt to protect the child that Sarah's bullet had killed along with its mother, and with blood covering every surface, in amounts that proved the violence had been immediate and brutal rather than prolonged suffering. The witnesses described a scene that looked like a battlefield, proof that forbidden love between master and enslaved woman had produced consequences as devastating as any violence deployed during slave rebellions or resistance movements, and evidence that the psychological pressures slavery created didn't just destroy enslaved people, but could erupt catastrophically to consume white families from within. If you want to know what happened next, how Texas society responded to these murders that exposed the sexual exploitation and psychological violence slavery enabled, and what lessons this tragedy teaches us about a system that corrupted everyone it touched, make sure you're subscribed to the Sealed Room where we bring you these deep dives into the darkest chapters of American history that mainstream narratives try to sanitize or ignore. Hit that like button to support this research into stories that matter. Stories that show slavery's true costs, not just for enslaved people, but for entire communities poisoned by an institution that treated humans as property while expecting them to function as emotional and sexual partners for people who owned them. Drop a comment telling me what you think about situations where love and ownership collided with such devastating results. and whether you believe genuine affection was even possible between people separated by slavery's legal categories, the deal. Aftermath of what Texas newspapers cautiously called the Blackwood Plantation tragedy sent shockwaves through the state's planting society that extended far beyond the specific deaths to force uncomfortable confrontations with the sexual exploitation, psychological violence, and fundamental instabilities that slavery both enabled and concealed beneath a veneer of civilized refinement and Christian morality. The triple death, master, enslaved lover, and murderous wife, became one of the most discussed scandals in Texas history, precisely because it exposed contradictions that everyone understood but no one openly acknowledged: that white men's exploitation of enslaved women was endemic and accepted as an informal privilege of ownership, that these relationships sometimes transcended simple exploitation to become genuine emotional connections that destroyed white marriages, that white wives suffered psychological torment from situations they had no legal or social mechanisms to resolve, and that the entire system was built on violence and coercion that could erupt catastrophically when the careful hypocrisies that sustained plantation society were violated too openly by men who refused to maintain the fiction that enslaved women they raped or loved were anything other than property. The immediate legal response to the murders revealed both the difficulty of prosecuting crimes where the perpetrator had committed suicide, and the complications created by the fact that one victim was an enslaved woman whose legal status as property, rather than person, created ambiguities about whether her death even constituted murder under Texas law as it existed in 1851. Sarah's detailed written confession eliminated any mystery about who had killed James and Eliza and why, but it also eliminated any possibility of criminal prosecution, since the murderer had delivered her own punishment through suicide before authorities could arrest or try her. The legal proceedings that followed focused primarily on estate settlement and custody of the orphaned children, rather than on criminal justice that the triple death had already rendered moot, revealing how completely the tragedy had disrupted normal mechanisms of wealth transfer and property management that defined plantation society's continuity across generations. The question of whether Eliza's death legally constituted murder under Texas law sparked considerable debate among legal scholars who noted that enslaved people occupied an ambiguous position in Southern jurisprudence, classified as property for most purposes but recognized as persons when it came to certain criminal offenses, including murder of enslaved people by free persons. The ultimate decision that Sarah had indeed committed murder by killing Eliza, not just destruction of property, represented a tacit acknowledgement that enslaved people possessed legal personhood even if they lacked legal rights. Though this acknowledgement came only after Sarah's death made the question academic rather than actionable. The debate revealed fundamental contradictions in how slave states conceptualized enslaved people, needing them to be property for economic purposes, but recognizing their humanity enough to criminalize killing them, creating legal frameworks that were internally incoherent but functionally useful for maintaining slavery while pretending to recognize basic human dignity. The disposition of Blackwood Plantation and its enslaved population following the deaths revealed how completely the tragedy had disrupted normal mechanisms of wealth transfer, as James's will had left everything to Sarah and their sons. But Sarah's suicide as a murderer created legal complications about whether she could inherit from a husband she had killed, making her death legally simultaneous with his for purposes of estate law. The children's minority status meant that guardians needed to be appointed to manage their interests and the property until the boys came of age, and James's brother Thomas eventually assumed control of both the plantation and guardianship of his orphaned nephews, immediately making decisions that would have profound consequences for everyone at Blackwood. Thomas Blackwood's first action as guardian and executor was to sell Blackwood Plantation itself to settle debts and create manageable trust funds for his nephews, recognizing that the property carried a reputation that made profitable operation difficult, and that the boys would be better served by liquid assets than by a plantation associated with such scandal. The fate of the enslaved people at Blackwood following the murders and the property sale represented another tragedy layered on top of the deaths, as families that had lived together for generations were separated and sold to various purchasers throughout Texas and the Deep South, destroying communities and relationships in the service of settling white people's financial affairs. Samuel, who had witnessed the murders from hiding, was sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where he would labor until Union forces liberated him in 1863. Martha, who had discovered Sarah's body, was purchased by a family in Louisiana, where she spent 12 more years in bondage before emancipation finally came. The dispersal destroyed the community that had formed at Blackwood over decades and ensured that many people who had known Eliza and witnessed James's genuine affection for her would spend their remaining years in slavery without the relative protections that his love had provided, proving that even the most privileged position within slavery offered no lasting security for enslaved people, whose fates depended entirely on white people's decisions about property and money and scandal management. The children, 2 sons aged 6 and 4 at the time of the murders, were raised by their Uncle Thomas, who faced the impossible task of explaining why both their parents were dead and helping them process trauma that included not just loss but the knowledge that their mother had murdered their father because he loved an enslaved woman more than his wife, creating psychological burdens that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Thomas's approach to raising his nephews involved a combination of strict discipline meant to counteract the chaos of their early childhood and strategic silence about the specific circumstances of their parents' deaths, apparently believing that not discussing the tragedy would help the boys forget, or at least not be defined by what their mother had done. But the strategy of silence failed spectacularly as the boys grew into adolescence and began asking questions that Thomas couldn't or wouldn't answer adequately, forcing them to piece together the story from gossip and rumors and partial truths that were probably more damaging than honest explanation would have been. The older son, James Jr., grew into a troubled young man who never married and spent his adult life struggling with alcohol and depression that contemporaries attributed to unresolved trauma from his parents, violent deaths, and his inability to reconcile his love for both parents with the knowledge that his mother had murdered his father. He died in 1873 at age 28 from what was officially recorded as accident, but what family members privately acknowledged was likely suicide, completing a tragedy that had destroyed 2 generations of Blackwoods through violence that originated in slavery's poisonous effects on human relationships. The younger son, Thomas Jr., married but was described by contemporaries as emotionally distant and incapable of genuine intimacy, as if watching his father's love destroy his family had convinced him that allowing himself to feel deeply for anyone was dangerous and destructive, creating a life of surface functionality but emotional emptiness that his wife and children found profoundly isolating. The scandal's impact on Texas plantation society extended beyond the specific case to create profound anxiety about the instability inherent in a system where white men routinely exploited enslaved women while their wives were expected to ignore or accept behavior that systematically undermined their marriages and their dignity, where legal ownership meant nothing when confronted with genuine emotion, and where violence lurked beneath the surface of civilized refinement, waiting to erupt when social conventions were violated too openly. The Blackwood tragedy became shorthand for the dangers of taking relationships with enslaved women too seriously or allowing them to become too open, with plantation mistresses throughout Texas using Sarah's fate as cautionary tale about what happened when wives tried to address situations that social convention demanded they ignore, while plantation masters cited James's death as evidence that openly preferring enslaved concubines over legal wives was asking for trouble regardless of genuine feelings involved. But the story also became part of enslaved people's oral traditions throughout Texas and beyond, understood very differently by people who had experienced or witnessed the sexual exploitation that slavery enabled and who recognized that the violence at Blackwood represented not an aberration but a predictable outcome of a system built on treating humans as property while expecting them to function as emotional and sexual partners. For enslaved women throughout the South, Eliza's story represented both the best and worst outcomes of relationships with white men who owned them, as she had achieved relative comfort and genuine affection but had ultimately been murdered by a white woman's jealous rage, proving that even the most privileged position within slavery offered no real safety or protection from violence that could come from any direction. For enslaved communities generally, the murders demonstrated that plantation families were more fragile and unstable than their pretensions to civilized refinement suggested, that the violence inherent in slavery could erupt in unexpected ways that sometimes destroyed masters along with enslaved people, and that white people's internal conflicts about love and ownership and sexual access created dangers for enslaved people who had no agency in situations, created entirely by white choices and white violence. The broader cultural impact of the Blackwood tragedy manifested in various literary and political discussions about slavery, race, and sexuality during the 1850s, as the national debate over slavery's future intensified in the decade before the Civil War. Abolitionists cited the case as evidence that slavery corrupted everyone it touched, creating situations where masters who exploited enslaved women destroyed their own families, where mistresses became murderers from jealousy and humiliation that the system created but refused to acknowledge, and where enslaved people had no protection against violence from any direction, regardless of whether masters claimed to love them or not. Frederick Douglass referenced the Blackwood murders in an 1852 speech about slavery's moral corruption, arguing that when a system allows men to own women as property while claiming to love them as partners, when it gives wives legal power but no emotional security, and when it produces violence that destroys white families along with black lives, that system has revealed itself as fundamentally evil and unsustainable, poisoning every relationship it touches until violence becomes the only language anyone can speak. Pro-slavery advocates struggled to address the case because it exposed contradictions they preferred to deny, ultimately settling on narratives that blamed Sarah's individual instability rather than acknowledging systemic problems with an institution that gave white men unlimited sexual access to enslaved women while expecting their wives to accept such exploitation without complaint or recourse. Southern newspapers that covered the tragedy carefully framed it as an isolated incident involving a mentally unstable woman, rather than as evidence of broader problems with slavery's sexual dynamics. With one Texas editor writing that Mrs. Blackwood's tragic actions reflect individual madness rather than any fault in our social institutions, as countless other plantation families maintain harmony and order, despite similar circumstances that they handle with the discretion and restraint that Mrs. Blackwood so unfortunately lacked. The defensive tone of such coverage revealed Southern anxiety about how the case might be used by abolitionists to attack slavery itself, and the determination to prevent the Blackwood murders from becoming ammunition in the growing national debate about whether slavery should be allowed to expand into new territories or should be abolished entirely. The letters that Sarah had left before her suicide became objects of intense interest and controversy. When excerpts were published in Texas newspapers despite her family's attempts to suppress them, as her writing to her children revealed a woman who understood that her actions were monstrous, but who felt that she had been pushed beyond endurance by a situation that no one would help her resolve. "I know what I have done will mark me as a monster in your memories and in history," she had written. "But I hope someday you will understand that your father's open love for Eliza destroyed something fundamental in me that could not be repaired by prayer or patience or accepting my situation as the price of social position. I tried everything I could think of to end the humiliation or to bear it, from seduction to separation to public confrontation. But nothing worked because your father genuinely loved her more than he would ever love me, and I could not live knowing that I meant nothing to the man I married while an enslaved woman meant everything to him." The letters revealed Sarah's awareness that her actions would be judged harshly by history, but also her conviction that she had been driven to murder by circumstances that Texas society had no mechanisms to address, that gave white wives every legal advantage except the ability to command their husbands' affections or escape marriages that had become unbearable. Eliza's perspective, reconstructed from letters she had written before her death and from testimonies of enslaved people who had known her, revealed a woman who had understood the precariousness of her position despite James's genuine affection and who had maintained no illusions about whether love between master and enslaved woman could ever be freely given or received. Her final letter to her mother, written just 2 months before the murders, had expressed both gratitude for the relatively comfortable life James's affection provided and awareness that it could end catastrophically at any moment. "I know how fortunate I am compared to most enslaved women who face violence and exploitation without even the pretense of affection," she had written. "But I am not deceived into thinking that comfort and kindness from someone who owns me represents real love as free people understand it, or that the child I carry will be anything other than enslaved regardless of its father's feelings, or that Mrs. Blackwood's rage will remain controlled forever when every day brings new evidence that her husband prefers my company to hers. I am grateful for what I have, but I understand that everything could be taken away by death or sale or violence, and that my position depends entirely on circumstances I cannot control. The question of whether James genuinely loved Eliza or whether he simply convinced himself that his sexual exploitation of an enslaved woman constituted love became the subject of considerable debate among historians studying the case, with scholars divided about whether genuine affection was even possible between people separated by slavery's fundamental power imbalance. Some historians argue that James's willingness to violate social conventions, to risk his marriage, and ultimately to die reaching for Eliza demonstrated emotional connection that transcended the legal categories that defined their relationship, suggesting that love can exist even in situations fundamentally compromised by power and coercion. Others contend that calling such relationships love ignores the reality that Eliza had no freedom to refuse James's initial advances or to leave the relationship if she chose, that everything she received from him was contingent on his continued affection, and that her children would be enslaved regardless of their father's feelings, making the relationship fundamentally coercive regardless of whatever genuine emotions James experienced. Dr. Margaret Chen, a contemporary professor of African American history at Rice University, has written extensively about the Blackwood case and its significance for understanding enslaved women's experiences under slavery's sexual exploitation. Eliza's story forces us to grapple with complicated questions about agency, consent, and affection in situations where legal power dynamics made free choice impossible, Dr. Chen argues in her book Masters, Mistresses, and the Enslaved Women Between Them. We can acknowledge that James apparently felt genuine affection for Eliza while also recognizing that calling it love erases the fundamental coercion that characterized every interaction between master and enslaved woman, that Eliza's choices were always constrained by the reality that refusing James or leaving the relationship could result in punishment or sale, and that the relative privilege she enjoyed came at the cost of other enslaved women who faced violence without even the protection of a master's affection. The tragedy is not that Sarah murdered a love affair, but that slavery created situations where exploitation could masquerade as affection and where enslaved women had to navigate impossible circumstances without any real power over their own lives or bodies. The Civil War, which began less than 10 years after the Blackwood tragedy, was interpreted by some observers as divine judgment on a society that had produced such moral corruption and violence, with abolitionists noting parallels between Sarah's murderous rage destroying her family and the larger societal violence that would destroy the plantation system itself. The fact that Texas would see significant military action and that formerly enslaved people would celebrate their liberation in 1865 seemed to some like cosmic justice for a system that had enabled tragedies like the one at Blackwood, where legal ownership combined with sexual exploitation and psychological violence to poison relationships so thoroughly that murder became inevitable. Union soldiers who occupied parts of Texas during Reconstruction heard stories about Blackwood Plantation from formerly enslaved people, with one officer writing in his diary that the tale of how a master's love for his slave destroyed his entire family reveals slavery's corruption more clearly than any abolitionist tract could manage, proving that the institution poisoned everyone it touched regardless of wealth or social position or genuine feeling. The site of Blackwood Plantation itself changed hands multiple times over the following decades, with each successive owner discovering that the property carried a reputation that made it difficult to attract labor or to operate profitably, and by the 1870s portions of the former plantation had been purchased by formerly enslaved families who established small farms on land where their ancestors had labored in bondage. Eliza's cabin, where the murders occurred, was torn down within months of the tragedy by Thomas Blackwood, who apparently believed that removing physical evidence of the scandal would help his nephews forget or heal from trauma that continued to define them regardless of whether the building stood. The graves of James, Sarah, and Eliza became sites of different forms of memorialization that reflected how various communities understood the tragedy and assigned moral responsibility for what had occurred. James and Sarah were buried in the family cemetery on what had been Blackwood land, with markers that made no mention of the circumstances of their deaths, their children apparently wanting to forget rather than commemorate the violence that had orphaned them and destroyed 2 generations of their family. Eliza was initially buried in the slave cemetery without any marker. her grave indistinguishable from dozens of others where enslaved people who had lived and died at Blackwood were interred without names or dates or any acknowledgement of their individual existence. But in the 1890s, formerly enslaved people who had known Eliza erected a simple stone that read, Eliza, 1829-1851, beloved by many, murdered by one. May she rest in peace that eluded her in life, creating a memorial that acknowledged both her death and the community that had valued her, even as her relationship with James destroyed her. The stone stood until the 1920s when it was vandalized and removed by persons unknown, though local oral tradition among black families claimed that white residents had destroyed it because they didn't want enslaved people commemorated as individuals, deserving of memory or respect. Modern historians studying the Blackwood tragedy have documented extensive evidence from letters, court records, newspaper accounts, and oral histories provided by descendants of enslaved people who witnessed the events, creating a comprehensive record that allows us to understand the case not just as isolated incident, but as window into the sexual exploitation, psychological violence, and fundamental instabilities that characterize plantation society throughout the slave South. The case has become a touchstone for discussions about enslaved women's experiences under slavery's sexual coercion, about the psychology of white women who witnessed their husbands' infidelities but had no recourse, about whether genuine love was possible between people separated by slavery's legal categories, and about the violence inherent in a system that treated human beings as property, while expecting them to function as emotional and sexual partners for people who owned them. Dr. Robert Williams, a contemporary professor of Southern history at the University of Texas, argues that the Blackwood case reveals fundamental contradictions that made slavery's collapse inevitable. When a system requires white men to view enslaved people as property for economic purposes, but allows them to form emotional attachments that contradict property status, when it gives white women legal power over enslaved people but no protection against their husbands' sexual exploitation of women they jointly own, and when it creates psychological pressures that erupt into violence destroying white families along with black lives, that system has revealed itself as fundamentally unstable and unsustainable. Dr. Williams writes in his book Texas Slavery and Its Discontents, "The Blackwood tragedy wasn't an aberration but a predictable outcome of contradictions that existed in thousands of plantation households, most of which avoided murder only through strategic silence and accepted hypocrisy that allowed everyone to pretend that sexual exploitation wasn't happening or didn't matter for family stability." The legacy of the Blackwood tragedy extends into contemporary discussions about sexual violence, coerced relationships, and the ways that systems of oppression create psychological trauma for everyone they touch, including those who benefit materially from them. The story serves as a reminder that slavery corrupted not just the enslaved, but also the enslavers, creating situations where even genuine emotion became tainted by power dynamics that made free choice impossible, where legal marriage provided no protection against emotional abandonment, where racial privilege meant nothing when confronted with genuine affection between master and slave, and where the fundamental violence of treating humans as property could erupt in unexpected ways that destroyed lives across racial boundaries. The devastating story of James, Eliza, and Sarah challenges us to grapple with impossible questions about love and power, and the psychological destruction that slavery inflicted on everyone it touched, forcing us to recognize that the institution's evil extended beyond the direct violence inflicted on enslaved people to poison every relationship and corrupt every family that participated in human bondage. If this tale of forbidden affection and murderous jealousy in 1851, Texas has moved you or made you think differently about the human costs of a system that treated people as property while expecting them to function as emotional and sexual partners, share this video with others who appreciate complex stories that refuse to offer simple moral judgments, but instead force us to confront the contradictions and violence inherent in American slavery. These are the stories that remind us that slavery destroyed everyone it touched. The enslaved people who suffered its direct violence and sexual exploitation, the white men who exercised power without accountability or moral coherence, the white women who witnessed their degradation without recourse or support, and the children who inherited trauma from systems that had corrupted their parents beyond redemption. The Blackwood tragedy teaches us that some situations have no heroes, only victims of institutions so fundamentally evil that they poisoned every relationship they touched, including those that might have been love if they had occurred between free people rather than between master and slave, between owner and property, between people whose legal relationship made genuine partnership impossible, regardless of whatever emotions they experienced. Until next time, remember that understanding history's darkest chapters helps us recognize injustice in our own time, and that studying how slavery corrupted human relationships reminds us why systems that treat people as property must be opposed wherever they emerge, whether in historical contexts or in modern forms of exploitation that continue to poison human dignity and destroy the possibility of genuine connection between people who should be equals, but whom circumstances have rendered unequal.